My name is Carol Muirden. I'm one of the co-chairs of the Friends of Contemporary Art and Photography Steering Committee. Thank you for coming. It's a very interesting topic tonight. I think you'll have a great time. Before we start, I want to announce something great. Do you remember last October we had an event for members of Friends of Contemporary Art at the Halpin Building, the annex to the Museum of Art? I don't know how many of you were there, but we announced a campaign to raise $10,000, and $5,000 of that would be from FOCAP members, and $5,000 would be matched by FOCAP. Guess what? We're at $25,000. Isn't that great? Yeah. So sometimes you wonder what membership dues go toward. It goes toward things like that, matching contributions, supporting the Museum of Art, in any way that we can, not just acquisitions and events. And then speaking of events, I also wanted to point out that you come to these events and it's not transparent to you all the work that everybody does to make these successful and to make sure that you have a good time. So personally, I'd like to thank the Museum of Art staff. I'd like to thank the foundation. Lindsay is an excellent ally to the steering committee, Friends of Contemporary Art and Photography. I'd like to thank all the logistical people and the steering committee for the Friends of Contemporary Art and Photography. We all work really hard to make sure that the programs that we present are interesting to you. So tonight's agenda looks like this. Christian is going to talk about Zozobra, the history, etc. Then we're going to go out that door, and we're going to go through the gallery where you can deposit your glooms, and then to the reception after that. So reception will be open until 7 o'clock. So at this time, I'd like to introduce Christian Waguespack, the 20th, I got his name right, I'm practicing, 20th century curator of 20th century art for the Museum of Art. So thank you very much again for coming. Have a good time.
Good evening, everybody. Can you all hear me? Yes. Thank you for coming. I know this was a pretty gloomy day, so I'm happy that everybody was able to make it. And I also want to, just before I get started, thank FOCAP for inviting me to come and to share my passion and enthusiasm for 20th century art with you guys. I hope that you'll enjoy what I have to share with you guys tonight. So as of this moment, it is 197 days, 3 hours, 51 minutes, and 27 seconds until Old Man Gloom goes up in smoke. Today, I want to share with you a bit of the history and artistic influences behind Zozobra. Now, Zozobra is a figure that we Santa Feans are very familiar with, and I dare say maybe a little over-familiar with. Sometimes it gets to be too much. But he's a great kind of icon for the city. He's a fantastically unique character that the artistic personalities of the 20th century that we're all so fond of came together to kind of create. And I want to share with you some of the history and some of the broader cultural influences in Santa Fe, in the Southwest, and globally and internationally that informs Zozobra. And will kind of maybe hopefully give you a broader appreciation for this horrible, dastardly figure that we love to burn every single year. So I want to get started with the history. As we all know, Zozobra couldn't have just come out of the blue. And Zozobra, you can't have Zozobra without Fiestas, right? Zozobra is the marker of the beginning of Fiestas. But how did this come to be? Zozobra was only introduced into the Fiestas in 1926. But the Fiestas are, of course, far, far older than that. Where's the connection there? What brought these two kind of disparate events together? I want to start with this question. Can you imagine Fiestas without Zozobra? Of course we can. We've got tons of historical documents that tell us exactly what the Fiestas were like before Zozobra was introduced. And by many accounts, they were actually sort of dull. And we'll talk about that later. What this leaflet is really doing is driving home exactly how integrated Santa Fe's Fiestas and Zozobras have become since the 20s. The centuries-old event steeped in, colonial history, Spanish pride, very murky and touchy political ideas that we're not going to go into tonight too deeply, and this fantastical figure that folks have come together to burn. What happened? I also want to point out that, in fact, Zozobra may arguably now be even more iconic than the figure on the right. Are we all familiar with her? La Conquistadora, right? A fantastic figure. She lives just down the street in the cathedral. Some of you, maybe, I just actually went to go visit her yesterday because we started the Lenten season, and though she's painted blue in this painting, which is part of the museum's collection, and was on display a little over a year ago at Imagining New Mexico, her outfits change with the season. So now if you go and see her, she's wearing this beautiful purple outfit to celebrate Lent. Anyhow, she is kind of iconographic of the Fiestas, and whenever we have the Fiestas, we center them around this fantastic figure. So what's her story? She comes from Mexico. She's really special in an American context because she was christened by the Pope himself as the oldest religious statue in North America. So, what's that story? A priest in the late 1500s in Mexico City bought her from a saint maker. And during the first kind of, I wouldn't say conquest because it wasn't very successful, the first foray into New Mexico by the Spanish, she came along with them. Now, as we know, that wasn't entirely successful because of the Pueblo Revolt. The Spanish were removed. So why is she called the Conquistadora in the first place, right? There was no actual conquest. It's an interesting little linguistic thing. In Spanish, the Conquistadora, that idea of to conquer, doesn't necessarily mean in the power relation that we see it today. It's more a term of endearment, the idea of conquering somebody's heart and soul through love. So that was the original relationship and connotation of her name, the Conquistadora. And then, of course, after the re-entry, she took on that secondary meaning of being Our Lady of the Reconquest of New Mexico. So, in a lot of ways, I like to think of her as Zozobra's great-great-great-great-grandmother, right? Without her, Zozobra would have never been able to happen. So, moving forward, what happened? Don Diego de Vargas led an expedition to reconquer the territory of New Mexico. He accomplished his task in September of 1692, with the recapturing of Santa Fe specifically. And it wasn't very smooth, right? There was that myth of the peaceful reconquering, where the colonists came up from around what we now know as Juarez and El Paso, with the idea that they would be able to settle. They get to Santa Fe, find out the people living here hadn't left, and were kind of stationed for several months on this really horrible windswept hill north of Santa Fe. It was in December, lots of people died. It was a really uncomfortable time for folks, but Diego de Vargas was patient, and eventually he was able to re-enter and reconquer Santa Fe, and we know that story. So in order to remember this famous event, the leading community of Santa Fe came together and made the proclamation that there would be an annual fiesta, a celebration of the Spanish reconquering of New Mexico, and it's centered around the figure of the Conquistadora, this beautiful religious figure that we still have. This went on for some years. It's a little bit murky exactly what the history of the fiestas was in these early days. There wasn't, of course, photography and these great records of how people would celebrate it. But it fell off after a while. And fiestas as we know them today are actually an invention of Edgar Lee Hewitt, who some of you may have heard of. The founder of our museum, an anthropologist and archaeologist, and he directed both the Museum of New Mexico system and the American Research, School for American Research. So in 1919, in an attempt to draw tourism to New Mexico and revive a lot of local traditions, right? New Mexico was just in the wake of new statehood, and Hewitt and other intellectual figures were trying as hard as they could to really put New Mexico's best foot forward to argue for, why is this place a state? Why is it valuable for the rest of the United States? And they found that legacy in our culture. So as part of that, Hewitt decided that he wanted to reinstate the fiestas. And he did so with his museum staff. And it was a 3-day event that involved a procession, programs, performances, Indian dances, and the such, just to commemorate the history of Santa Fe in general. And the annual fiestas happened each year ever since in September. Now, not everybody was excited about the fiestas as Hewitt was. By the mid-1920s, it appeared to many Santa Feans that the fiestas had become kind of dull and commercialized, that they were really more geared towards attracting tourists from the East than they were to really celebrate Santa Fe's history for Santa Feans or for New Mexicans. And particularly the artistic community of Santa Fe wanted to do something about this. And this quote is by Gustav Baumann. and it's from a letter in 1926, and it's him kind of ruminating on what he saw as the dullness of the Fiestas. So, to quote Bauman, primarily conceived as home entertainment, it has of late years been used as a means to attract tourists and been given much publicity hard to live up to. With enthusiastic sponsors, a fiesta may grow bigger, but not necessarily better. It's only better when everybody brings their good times with them. This seems difficult for people who do not play naturally, but expect a quick shot of vicarious enjoyment, end quote. And I should say that this idea was really symptomatic of what the artists of the time were thinking. And one thing that we really need to understand before we can move forward is about the artistic community of the 20s, these people were all about having a good time. They loved to get together. I think many of us have probably heard about the Cinco Pinturas being described as 5 little nuts and 5 mud huts. They would have a party for anything. You know, if a few people dropped by, the next thing you know, it's a roaring party. They were having great times, and they really valued, above all, coming out west and enjoying life to the fullest. So to see this pageantry of Santa Fe history become something dull and commercialized really, really bothered these folks. And they wanted to do something about it. They wanted to bring life and creativity and art and enjoyment to everything that they touched and everything that Santa Fe touched. And so I just need to scroll down really quick. In an article published in the New Mexican magazine in 1950, Will Schuester described the first burning of Zozobra and what led him and Gustav Baumann and these people to feel like they needed something like a Zozobra to liven up fiestas in the first place. And so this is to quote Schuester. E. Dana Johnson, who was then the editor of the Santa Fe New Mexican, and I got together to hatch out a show for the fiestas. So they were trying to do something to make this better. This is what they came up with. It was not the fiestas of the Marquis de Peñuel, but actually amounted to a revolutionary protest fiesta, staged by the artists and writers of the community and called El Pasatiempo, the pastime. It was a protest against the regular fiesta, which was becoming dull and commercialized, end quote. And this painting that I have up on the screen now, you can go see over at the History Museum. It's up now. It's by Gustav Baumann, and it's titled The Pasatiempo Parade of Santa Fe of 1926. So this was painted at the same time that he was writing the letter that I just read to you. And it's really a fantastic image. So what we're seeing here is, of course, the plaza, but the parade that's surrounding it isn't the actual fiesta as it would have been known at the time. What we're seeing instead are all of these really, farcical kind of mockeries of the fiesta. So you've got Baumann painting people dressed up as Native Americans in a boat doing paddling. You've got a coyote in a cage. You've got people doing fake bullfighting. It was incredibly absurd. And by a lot of standards today, probably not entirely politically correct. But the idea was to just shake things up as much as they possibly could with this complete fantastical mockery and farce of what the fiestas had become. It's all about having fun. So of this group of artists and writers that developed the Pasatiempo, the two that are most directly responsible for the development of Zozobra himself are Will Schuester and Gustav Baumann. And we see them here. This is Will Schuester next to Zozobra head that's become as large as him by this point. And then Gustav Baumann in his beret, smoking a cigarette, looking incredibly artistic, playing with his famous marionettes. And we'll get back to those in a second and why they're important. But I want to start with the character of Will Schuester. Will Schuester was a character. And I want to give you a little bit of his history because it's not an incredibly lighthearted or fun history, but I think that once we come to understand a little bit about Schuster's background, we can understand better how and why he was able to bring so much fun and play and liveliness and invention into everything he did once he got to New Mexico. So Schuester served in World War I as a soldier. He was at the Battle of Verdun, where he got mustard gassed, and he ended up with only 1/3 of one lung left after that, if you can imagine. At the same time, if that wasn't bad enough, he contracted tuberculosis. After the war, he came back. He was living in Philadelphia, and his doctor, who was also coincidentally his cousin, that's not incredibly important, told him that he had about a year to live, so essentially cast a death sentence. But gave him the opportunity, made a suggestion. If you stay in this climate, this eastern climate of cold and wet, you're never going to heal. But like so many people, there are other options. His doctor told him if, however, he moved to a dry, high climate in the West, he had a good chance of dying of snakebite, old age, or bad whiskey. Pretty good odds. So like so many people, Will Schuester moved west for health. And I should say, whenever I say like so many people, really almost everybody involved with our museum in the 20s and late 10s ended up in New Mexico because of tuberculosis. This room that you're sitting in right now could just as easily be considered a temple to tuberculosis as it could be a temple to art. Everybody who worked on it came out here because of that problem, to heal. But at the time, there was also this idea that one shouldn't leave the place where you healed or you'll get sick again. So people stayed. Maybe not super great for them, wonderful for Santa Fe, because we got this great artist community. So he moved out here, and over his life, when asked about coming west, he said famously, "I came out here to die. I'm still waiting it out." And I wanted to include this picture of him, because I think it just does a fantastic job of showing how playful, how not seriously he took life. And at every chance, trying to enjoy himself, trying to have fun, not take himself too seriously. And I think that absolutely came from this early brush with mortality, right? The idea that when one is given only a year left to live, you pour every bit of yourself into every artistic endeavor that you possibly can. And that's really what we saw and we'll still see in Schuster's creative output. He played with everything. He wasn't the best classically trained artist. He wasn't the best classically trained sculptor. But he would give anything a shot. He would go to painting classes. If somebody suggested that he try printmaking, he would do it, because quite frankly, why not? He was only supposed to live for a year anyway. And he really poured enjoyment into this. And he was one of the people who was the life and soul of Santa Fe, turning every single thing into a party. And I think this photograph just completely sums up his sense of humor perfectly. So I think that you really need this person who's so enamored with joy and life and love to come up with a figure like Zozobra, because when you've dedicated your life to living it to the fullest, to making every moment joyful and full of art, what's your greatest enemy? Gloom. And Zozobra is, of course, Old Man Gloom. So even that, he personified into something fun. Now, the other person who was directly responsible for the invention of Zozobra is Gustav Baumann, and he was a completely different type of character. He loved fun, he was here for good times, but this man must have never slept. He tried his hand at almost every single medium of the 20th century that you could possibly imagine and mastered it. Gustav Baumann's perhaps best known for his Japanese-style woodblock prints of almost anything. We've got the largest collection of them here, and they'll be displayed throughout kind of the run of Horizons. We've got one set up now that they're going to rotate, so folks coming back can get a broader idea of what Baumann worked with. But the other thing that he really excelled at was marionette making. And this, a lot of people say came from his German upbringing, right? That, Central Europe, Germany, and the Czech Republic is really the heart of marionette artistry, even today. If you go to the Czech Republic, a marionette shows very serious artistic business. And Baumann probably picked that up through that. He was of German descent, and then he went back and studied art in Germany, too. The marionettes he put together, particularly for play with his daughter. His daughter aspired to be an actress. So what does an aspiring artist do to that? He makes a stage in their house. We've reconstructed one of Baumann's stages in the galleries. So whenever you see it, I want you to imagine that thing in your living room, because that's where it stayed for the Baumann family. And he wrote his own scripts, and he would make these characters and play them out with his daughter, who's pictured here, so she and he could connect over his love of creativity and her love of acting and fantasy and play. So these figures really came out of Gustav Baumann's desire to play and to fantasize and to enjoy. And I like this one because it's got his daughter, but you also see the dragon that's on display now, and it's the very same dragon that's in this picture. So when you're in the gallery, look that up. And I want to kind of focus on the marionettes a bit, because essentially that's kind of what Zozobra is. Zozobra is a giant marionette. So in that sense, I like to think of all of Baumann's marionettes as Zozobra's stepbrothers. So when you see them, think of them that way. Or sisters, or dragons. Now, how did Zozobra actually come to be when these two characters came together? What I'm showing you guys now is, to my knowledge, the earliest photograph of Zozobra that we have. I haven't been able to locate a photograph of the very first Zozobra. It was built and burned in Schuster's backyard, and it was great, but it was also kind of a little bit of a mess. What happened was Zozobra, Schuester and Bauman got together and decided they wanted to create this creature that they would burn for Fiestas. In their enthusiasm to get this project going, they failed to get together about the scale of what the figure should be. And so Schuester built an enormous body, and Gustav Baumann brought a more modest head. So the figure kind of looked, so it was described as looking a bit like a pinhead, so this giant thing with a little bitty head. He was about 6 feet tall. But they burned him anyway, and they had a great time. And it continued and continued each year. And it was a party. Well, Schuester threw it in the house because his people would throw a party for anything. And in 1926, the Fiesta Council asked him to bring the idea of dispelling turbulence and gloom of the past year by burning Zozobra and evil to the Fiestas and making it a Fiesta event. So what I'm showing you here is the earliest documentation of Zozobra that we have. You'll notice in the background that turret is the cathedral, and there are a few little people there for scale. So what we're seeing here is really a monstrous figure, right? He's shirtless, he's very muscular, he's wearing a loincloth, and he's got this completely crazed, mad look in his eye. It's not exactly what Zozobra looks like today, but this is his early manifestation. Where did the idea of Zozobra come from? How did Schuester and Bauman think that building a giant effigy and burning it was something that should be done? Well, it's got roots. And the particular roots of Zozobra, as history tells us, come from the Yaqui Indians. Now, the Yaqui Indians are a group of people who live in the Sonora Desert in northern Mexico and southern Arizona. They still live there today. And for them, the most important celebration of the year is Holy Week, which we're in right now. And during Holy Week, the Yaqui Indians' custom is a 7-week period of dance, prayer, dances, prayers, and processions played out by evil men wearing masks, barefoot dancers with ankle rattles, and at the very end, they burn an effigy of Judas Iscariot. And that's what I'm showing you guys here. This is a contemporary image, probably taken from the looks of it like the 80s, I would say, and maybe southern Arizona or northern Mexico. And what we're seeing here is after that procession, you get a pile-up of the accoutrement, the costumes that folks would have worn, and then this figure of Judas, and you can kind of see like a head and arms, and he's burnt, and people gather around and celebrate the burning of this horrible figure. And of course, we all know, for Holy Week, why would you burn Judas? He's the one who betrayed Jesus, and you're taking out that frustration on this figure. Now, this kind of activity, this burning of a ritual figure, is called by anthropologists, it's a scapegoating ritual. We see it worldwide. We'll talk about that a bit more in a second. But the idea is it's a type of psychological catharsis where you're able to purify some time of the year through the symbolic destruction of something that embodies evil or badness in that sort of way. And that's what's going on here. It's a scapegoat. I mean, we all understand what that means. Judas is the scapegoat for any type of negativity that would happen during the year. I should say, though, our Zozobra comes from the Yaqui tradition. This is something that, this particular Judas burning, we see it all over Latin America. And I wanted to just bring in a Judas effigy being hung in Mexico City in the early part of the 20th century. So you'll see, there's Judas, and here is the crowd that's gathered to abuse him. And then in the other image, it's a burning of a Judas that's taking place all the way down in Brazil. So I wanted to kind of show you guys the span of this. And the Yaqui tradition kind of came out of this, so it's kind of a back and forth, showing that Zozobra's roots are really in this Pan-American tradition of burning Judas-like figures. I also wanted to bring this in because the idea, and these Judases, particularly from Mexico, essentially are piñatas. They're abused in a bit more of a creative way. You don't go after them with a stick, you fill them with fireworks and you burn them. But I think that it kind of is a tell at how piñata-able Zozobra has become. And ever since we started with Zozobra, there have always been Zozobra piñatas with the idea that if, the annual burning of Old Man Gloom isn't quite enough to get all of your frustration out, you can take one home and do it yourself. So I wanted to bring those in because I just thought really they were very cute. Those are on display at the National Hispanic Cultural Center if you want to see them in person. Now the colloquial Mexican engagement with Judas figures made its way into the modernist avant-garde in that region. And I wanted to talk just a little bit about Frida and Diego, both using Judas figures in their own work, as an engagement with regional Mexican iconography. So what's going on here in the 20th century in Mexico is artists are interested in this movement called indigenismo, where intellectuals, artists, painters are looking to Mexico's indigenous communities as an authentic means of finding a subject matter that's unique to their region, that they can apply modernist formalist principles to, but that speaks to their own experiences. And really this movement became Mexico's national art form, looking at native and indigenous traditions and styles and bringing them into national architecture, into the movement of muralism, and of course into the paintings of people like Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo, among all the other major Mexican modernists. And I think that this is particularly interesting because it shows how both Kahlo and Diego are using these figures in their own work. And I wanted to bring in this photograph on the bottom left. So what we see here is Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo with one of their Judas figures. If any of you have ever been to Mexico City and go to Diego Rivera's museum, the large lava stone pyramid that's incredibly impressive, when you go into the main gallery, it's still filled with the Judas figures that he made and kept in his studio and continued to make. And he was, he and Kahlo both are really invested in looking at native traditions as a form of authenticity to make their work a bit more meaningful. We even see this in Kahlo's later dress, right? In this upper image here, she chose to adopt regional dress, indigenous-based dress, to show her connection, at least, if not entirely authentically, intellectually, with the native cultures of Mexico. But in this bottom picture, I think it's really interesting because if you notice what she's wearing, it's not how we expect Frida Kahlo to be dressed. She's wearing essentially a jumpsuit. And this came from her engagement with a photographer and artist named Tina Madodi, who was as much a communist activist as she was an artist. And in fact, I think if she came back alive today and found out that her major legacy was in photography, she would be very upset. She got kicked out of Mexico for being a communist, she got kicked out of Russia for being a spy, and she ended up dying in her homeland of Italy. But she kind of impressed upon Kahlo at the time a connection with the worker. So whenever you see Frida Kahlo dressed in this way, it's because of her relationship with Tina Madodi and that kind of psychological moment. But Kahlo and Rivera both built these figures, made these figures in very much the same way that Schuester and Bauman were doing, looking at these regional traditions and incorporating it into their own artistic practice. One more thing that I want to point out here before we move on is the Kahlo painting at the top. It's called The Wounded Table, and it's actually an incredibly sad painting. It was begun in December of 1939 when Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera's divorce became final. They were getting a divorce because he was caught cheating on Frida with her own sister. So that wasn't fantastic. During that time, Frida left Diego and started working on this painting. And it's a monument, really, to her sorrow and her feeling of loss. And so, of course, we get this composition of the Last Supper with her in the middle. But what I think is interesting is that she's flanked by all these figures that have, to her, come to represent victimhood. The doe in the front shows up again and again and again in Kahlo paintings as a representation of herself. Usually it's pierced by arrows, and it speaks to her sense of being hurt by loved ones, her sense of being hurt by the actual physical calamities that continue to happen to her during her own life. You see her representation of children, and even the table itself is wounded. But here, she's flanked by these two Judas figures, which also become kind of a self-representation of a scapegoat and something that has been unfairly treated, right? And I wanted to kind of drive this home and ask you to kind of put it in the back of your mind, because whenever we get to looking at Fritz Scholder's painting of Zozobra, we've got a similar different take. It's very easy to think of Zozobra as a monster that deserves to be rounded up and burnt. But what happens when we begin to feel sympathy for the monster, like Kahlo did and like Scholder will do? And I just wanted to bring this in to take a minute to talk about these burning effigies and scapegoating figures in no means being unique to Latin America and the Southwest. And what I'm showing you here on the right is a wicker man. And a wicker man, it's a large wicker statue, which was reportedly used by the ancient Druids to sacrifice people, to perform human sacrifices, by burning an effigy. And in modern times, the Wicker Man has been kind of revived as part of neo-pagan themed ceremonies without the human sacrifice. But you can go to the British Isles and still find people burning these Wicker Man effigies in very much the same kind of scapegoat ritual way. It's a type of psychological community purification. And on the other side, Burning Man, which is America's Zozobra, essentially. It happens every summer in the California desert, where people who I would imagine themselves as pretty bohemian go out, are able to go out into the desert, shake off everyday norms, and engage in this festival, this revelry, this party that's centered around burning a large figure. So it's something that comes up again and again and again. Now I want to shift the theme to talk about Zozobra being a monster. And Zozobra is no doubt New Mexico's favorite monster. But he shares a lot with his monster cousins across the world. Aside from his fearsome appearance and continued antagonism toward his human neighbors, or perhaps because of it, Zozobra is hunted, and that's a really important part of the story. Something he has in common with some of the 20th century's most famous monsters. In 1932, the Santa Fe, New Mexican compared Zozobra to the Jersey Devil. And I think one of the reasons this is very important is that on the one hand, it's catering to an Eastern audience. Folks who aren't familiar with, Latin American Judas burning traditions would know the Jersey Devil. Everybody has its own regional kind of mythology. And they published a story, and that's the headline of the story there. Reports that Zozobra recall the famous case of the Jersey Devil. And I'm going to read it to you because it's very short, but very good. Once I can find the mouse. Well, I'll just start here. The case of the famous Jersey Devil, recalled by the sensationalist reports this week of the appearance of the monster Zozobra, or Old Man Depression, as the freak of nature in human semblance is called. Following reports by Cyrus McCormick Jr. that a 25-foot tall grotesque giant with rolling eyes and a tongue tore across McCormick's place near Nambe at night. Unfortunately, I printed the rest out because I can't make this scroll down. Leaving a trail of sparks and embers that uprooted a large cottonwood as he passed, and another report of his presence near Arroyo Hondo by Louise Pugh of DeVargas Street reports today that she heard a noise at her window last night, that an enormous clutching hand with 12-inch claws on the end came through a window, and she seized an old cavalry saber belonging to her great uncle, the Duke of Wellington, and cut off one of the claws. Whereupon the frightened nocturnal visitor, leaving several washtubs full of blood around the place, disappeared. The claw is on exhibition in a case in the second story of the old palace. So this was a news story that was published, and very sensational, really wonderful. But what I find particularly interesting about it is the idea of the large hand coming through the window and frightening the poor lady who was home alone. This was written in 1932. King Kong came out in 1933. So, I mean, really, you can't make this stuff up if you try.
Christian?
Yes? 5 minutes? Okay. So, we'll move ahead then. I wanted to kind of look a bit at other historic monsters here. Zozobra from 1924, bearing a really strong resemblance to Count Orlok of 1922. And of course, 1922 film Nosferatu was one of the most iconic monster movies of all time. And I think it's not a coincidence that Zozobra, New Mexico's most famous monster, came about at the same time that horror movies were really getting going in the 1920s. Also, Frankenstein. I would like to point out that the idea of a monster being chased by villagers as Zozobra was, encaptured a very kind of telling resemblance of Frankenstein being caught in the windmill by village people being burned, and Zozobra being burned by the people of Santa Fe. So this monster came through the 1930s. And then of course the 1940s, we didn't need to make up monsters to kind of embody our fears. They were real ones. And during this decade, Zozobra took the form of an amalgamation of Adolf Hitler, the Emperor of Japan, and Mussolini, and the figure Hirohito Moose. And he was burned too. And then, of course, during football season, Zozobra hopes that both teams lose. And really quickly, I want to go through some of the artists that have been inspired by Zozobra. Of course, Schuester, representing his own figure here. This is an early painting from 1929 that shows one of the first burnings of Zozobra. As you can see, it directly kind of relates to the picture that I showed you here. And Schuester has a particular interest and emphasis on revelry and partying. You can see the drunk people in the band very excited to see this go up. And this painting, which is on display at Horizons right now, 35 years later, the same kind of composition. Zozobra, looming large, but mostly focused on the revelry, the party, the fireworks, the fire. This painting was painted the same year that Zozobra was handed over to Kiwanis, and was painted for El Nadido, the restaurant up in Tesuque. Tapia is another artist who's engaged with Zozobra and his own work. This piece is also on display in Horizons. And the interesting thing about this here is I wanted to focus in on his attention paid to community, that he's situated Zozobra in Fiestas, that he's managed to paint the people who are celebrating, going around the bottom, with Zozobra in the middle. No, going the wrong way. And then the last artist that I wanted to talk about is Fritz Scholder. This piece isn't on exhibition, but it is from the museum's collection. Now, Fritz Scholder is best known for his images of Native Americans done in a really expressive style. This piece, Fake Dancer, is part of the collection and up in the galleries now. The other piece, Super Indian, is not up right now, but part of the museum's collection. They both show Schuster's interest in really expressive brushwork and color, and edging towards abstraction without being completely non-objective. What's less known about Fritz Scholder's work is his interest in the monstrous and the Gothic. And in his home back in Scottsdale, he had a collection of skulls, and he even owned an actual Egyptian sarcophagus. And he had several series that were based around ideas of demons and vampires and werewolves. So of course he would be interested in addressing New Mexico's most famous monster too. And here we of course see Scholder's brushwork, that expressive style where it kind of goes in and out of abstraction and figuration. The head exploding. But what I'd like to point out, it's difficult to see, is that coming down from the arm, there's blood, not just fire. And what I think is particularly interesting about Scholder's Zozobra, if we think back to Frida Kahlo's representation of the Judas figures, is his title, A Martyr in Santa Fe, New Mexico. That Scholder may actually be taking a more sympathetic view of Zozobra, thinking of him not as a horrible monster that needs to be gotten rid of, but as a victim. That he was a figure that was martyred perhaps unfairly. And now, I'd like to, I'll open it up for questions, but afterwards I'd like to invite everybody to head out to the galleries for our Gloom box, where you can deposit your own glooms. But before we go, I wanted to share one little quick thing. Doing the research for this talk, I ran across some pretty interesting things that have gone into Zozobra over the years. The original Zozobra was filled with tumbleweeds. Anybody driving around New Mexico knows what a tumbleweed can be. It's in the middle of your car. But not just little scraps of paper have gone in. One of the most interesting things, in 1999, the New Mexico State Police headquarters in Santa Fe donated, as stuffing, shredded obsolete police reports that included cold case murder files and personal divorce papers. A woman in New Orleans who went through Katrina had mailed her ruined wedding dress and asked that it be burned in Zozobra because she didn't want it around anymore and wanted to kind of exorcise that bad part of her life. And this hasn't happened yet, but a man named Ray, who lives in Santa Fe, and if any of you know him, I would like to meet him, owns a collection of Marilyn Monroe's gowns. One of them was shown in How to Marry a Millionaire, and a similar gown from How to Marry a Millionaire recently sold at auction for $4 million. And he has it in his will that he wants all of those gowns to be burned in Zozobra rather than sold at auction. So, those of you with glooms, we have a very high bar to set to be the most interesting glooms here. And that's what I have for you guys today. Any questions? Questions about Zozobra? Burning? No? Okay. Well, let's head to the gallery. Oh, yes?
Was there any American Indian equivalent or input into the Zozobra notion?
Not that I know of.
Or Yaki, I guess.
Well, I mean, the idea it was taken from the Yaki, but Zozobra as we know him, was really kind of invented by Schuester and, the 20th century guys, the syncopintorists in that group. So it's a good question. Anybody else? If not, we'll exit through here. And for those of you who didn't bring your own glooms, we have gloom paper. So you can write them.